Hello everybody, here is your audio lecture review. So if you're talking about evolution, of course you're going to define evolution and that it's change, but there's lots of aspects to it that are more complicated than that, but the definition is change. And we do change. Populations change, humans change over time. Lots of changes occur in many species. So if you're talking about evolution, you're talking about change, then you're also talking about survival of the fittest, which is natural selection. And lots of people always think, well, the biggest are always going to be the strongest and survive. But natural selection is really the best adapted for any situation. So if you have a room and you have a bunch of mice and you have a big wharf rat and you fumigate the room, well, prior to fumigating the room, the big wharf rat was probably going to beat up on all the little mice and win. But when you fumigated the room, the big wharf rat couldn't get out of any little cracks and spaces. But all the mice ran underneath the crack in the door. So the wharf rat was superior in one situation, not in the other one. And that happens in nature all the time. So don't think of natural selection as always the biggest is the baddest is the winner. That's not the case. So whenever you have adaptations, which organisms have, which allow them to either survive or not survive, you have different types of survival mechanisms or adaptations. You have behavioral adaptations, structural adaptations, biochemical adaptations, and physiological adaptations. So now we're just going to go through some questions, like what would I ask you in the test about this? Evolution definition is what? Change. Survival of the fittest is natural selection. What type of adaptations exist? Behavioral, structural, biochemical, and physiological. Who was the person that said you use something, a structure, or for instance, your brain, or you lose it? So use, disuse. That was Lamarck. He also thought that you had inherited acquired characteristics, like if Mike Tyson bit your ear off, then all your kids would be born with no ear, which is not true. And they debunked that by doing a study where they had a bunch of mice and they cut their tails off and they bred them and they saw whether or not the mice were born without tails. But the use disuse thing you could believe because when people get elderly, if they don't use their brain, people talk about and they do research about whether their brain capacity will be the same if you don't use it. So Darwin wrote, and Darwin is pretty much the person you think about when you think about evolution, but there's also a guy named A.R. Wallace who doesn't get a lot of credit, but A.R. Wallace and Darwin came up with their theories at the same time. So if I ask you who wrote The Origin of the Species, you would say Darwin. Populations evolve over time. It's not overnight, it's over time. Individuals usually don't get referred to as evolution. It's populations that scientists refer to as evolving. Where did Darwin study and on what ship? He studied in the Galapagos and he studied on the HMS Beagle. And when he studied the Galapagos, the first species that he studied were yellow finches. And the reason was he noticed that all their beaks were different. And he noticed that the tortoises looked the same as tortoises everywhere else. They were just much larger. So where did Darwin study? What ship did he study on? What were the first organisms he studied? All questions I could ask. Are certain insects over time resistant to pesticides that we spray on them? Yes, some can be stronger and survive a little bit of pesticide on them and then become tolerant to pesticides, or they can have genes that allow them to not be killed by certain pesticides. So I might ask you, can certain insects become pesticide resistant? And the answer is yes. When we look at evolution, we look at fossil record evidence, we look at continents, we look at things like Pangea, and then we look at how they fit together and now how they're separated. And do we find the same fossils both places? We look at DNA. We've found a small human, which they called a hobbit. We found Iceman. We found these types of fossils, and we found preserved bodies, relatively very preserved, that we have compared modern day humans and modern day animals to these past fossils that we found. We also look at distribution of species. Where do we have certain species? Where do they live at geographically? And that is called what? That is called biogeography. When you look at comparing structures that one organism has versus the structures of another organism, that's called comparative anatomy. We also look at, or when you look at common ancestry and common characteristics due to that ancestry, what would that be called? That's called homology. We also look at in the womb, what did the embryos look like in different organisms, and what is that called? That's called comparative embryology. We also look at DNA and compare DNA between organisms, and that's called molecular biology. And we look at gene pools, which is a collection of your genes, like what genes does this population have versus this population, or this group of people versus this group of people. When you're looking at natural selection and evolution, mutations, genetic recombination, crossing over, plate tectonics, continental drift, environmental factors, natural disasters, all of those will affect evolution over time. And when we look at evolution over time, we compare how things have evolved, and it's like a family tree. If they're on the same branch, they're going to be closer, they evolved more closely together and have more similar DNA. But if they're on different branches, they're not going to be as similar and they will not have evolved as closely together. And when we look at those trees, it's not called a family tree, it's called a phylogenetic tree or phylogeny, which is evolution of the history of a species. So I could ask you what a phylogenetic tree is or phylogeny, and I could ask you what factors affect evolution, which would be mutations, genetic recombination, plate tectonics, crossing over, etc. Also, you have genetic drift, which is environmental changes due to chance. So you might have, there can be environmental factors that cause this to happen. So you have environmental factors that actually affect your evolution that's going to occur, like when I discussed natural disasters earlier. You can have natural disasters, or you could have a big canyon cut through, like the Grand Canyon, that's going to separate some squirrels, and that's going to affect the evolution of those squirrels and how they evolve over time, because when they get separated, they're going to have different environments. You can also have something called bottleneck effect, where you have loss of genetic diversity over time, and if that occurs, that is called bottleneck effect. When you have genetic drift that we discussed earlier, genetic drift can also be where a few individuals colonize a new habitat. They can go to that new habitat. Because, like, if the canyon separates the squirrels, they're in different habitats. So that's an example of genetic drift. So I could ask you what genetic drift is. You can also have organisms that just decide, I don't like living here anymore. I'm going to go somewhere else. And that's called genetic flow. So that's movement of individuals between populations. They go somewhere else and live with a different population of people or a different population of animals. As you have evolution happen, you will have certain populations where more intermediate characteristics are favorable. Like if you have a crab and that crab has a small claw, for a certain environment, that small claw might be favorable. In other environments, a large, super large claw might be favorable. And in another environment, a medium-sized claw might be favorable. So a stabilizing selective favorability is when you have intermediate phenotypes that are favorable. So the medium-sized claw. When you have evolution and you have, just like now, a lot of people are out hunting deer. Very popular around here. So you have deer that are going to compete for mates. So when you have the buck deer that's going to compete for all the does, then that is called intrasexual competition, which is a competition for mates, usually by males. And then you have intersexual competition, and that's going to be when you have usually females, like birds, that are going to look for a mate in a male, and they're going to look for a really flashy colored male, like in robins, where you have them looking for a different species that's really flashy. You also have something called speciation, which is when you get a new species formed. If you get a new species, it's called speciation. You also can have something called reproductive isolation, which prevents different species from mating. So not all species can just intermate with each other. So reproductive isolation prevents that from occurring for many different reasons. You can also have some populations that can interbreed. Like sometimes you can have a grizzly bear and a polar bear breed, and you get a growler bear. And you can, in your PowerPoint, there's a picture of the growler bear, the grizzly, and the polar bear. You can also have something called, whenever you're looking at all these evolutionary theories, you can have something called parsimony, which is when they look at the simplest explanation for whatever they're observing, the phenomenon that they're observing. When you're looking at reproductive isolation, you can have also morphological species concept, which is where you classify these organisms based on observable traits. So when you're looking at evolution and you're looking at species, it's important to have these species classified. And when you have a species that gets separated, the controversial question that's come up for many years is, well, when do you classify that species as a new species? And if you have a growler bear, is that a new species? Well, I would say yes. So you have scientists that undergo and study taxonomy, and they're the ones that are going to be trying to classify organisms where they're supposed to be. And there's all kinds of classification questions that we'll talk about next semester. You can also have an ecological species concept, which is where they classify organisms based on their role or their niche. And niche is their job and within their society. So you have morphological species concept and ecological species concept. You also have some other things that prevent mating. So you have something called prezygotic barriers. So you need to know what prezygotic barriers are. And you need to know what postzygotic barriers are. Postzygotic is the example in your PowerPoint notes where you have a mule and a horse, which creates a donkey. The mule and the horse are both sterile, but donkeys are not sterile. So you have two organisms that are sterile that produce a non-sterile offspring. You also have evolution, and an iconic thing that has been studied for many years is you will have evolution of horses, and they'll show where horses were small, like the size of a large dog. And every time they've gotten larger, leg length has gotten larger, etc. When you're looking at evolution, you also have plants, and in plants they can like double their number of chromosomes and be just fine, like in ferns. And you really can't see an effect. You get a mutation, you get a new species, a fern, you get plants that do this. And scientists estimate that 80% of the plant population that we have is due to this duplicating of chromosomes called polyploidy. So when you have more than two complete sets of chromosomes, you have polyploidy. In humans, it's fatal. No one has ever lived knowingly that scientists know of that has polyploidy. It can cause miscarriages. It can cause stillbirths. Polyploidy can. But in plants, polyploidy is no big deal. So polyploidy can be taken into account both in genetics and in evolution, because in genetics, it's going to affect the outcome of offspring, etc. For humans, it's going to cause miscarriages, and in plants, it's just going to cause a new species to be formed. But in evolution, you're going to look at this and follow why does this happen, and look at the types of plants over time and how they've changed due to this polyploidy. Whenever you're looking at evolution from common ancestors, if something has evolved from a common ancestor, like if a bunch of insects have evolved from one insect, then that is called adaptive radiation. And you need to know what adaptive radiation is. You also need to know, as I said earlier, that Darwin studied on the HMS Beagle at the Galapagos Islands. He didn't just study there. He was a naturalist on the HMS Beagle. He also helped to map the ocean floor so they wouldn't run aground. So he studied and made observations for many years. So let's talk about the earliest forms of life on Earth. They think that prokaryotes were here first and then eukaryotes. And some of the earliest evidence of life are stromatolites, and they're actually still here, present on Earth today, in Australia in Shark Bay. And they look like rocks, but they're actually organisms. So you need to know about stromatolites. Whenever you're looking at large patterns of evolution, that's called macroevolution. So broad patterns of changes, macroevolution. Whenever you're thinking about the Earth and what it used to look like, you have Pangea. Now we don't have Pangea. You had some other ones. Whenever you're looking at animals that are no longer here, that's called extinction. You also have this concept of evo-devo in evolution. Evo-devo is evolutionary and developmental biology, and the comparisons and the collaboration of the two to look at evolutionary patterns. Scientists have looked at the molecular DNA, molecular evolution to look at DNA and make comparisons, and they've actually sequenced or mapped 110 billion bases, nitrogen bases of DNA from thousands of different species to make these comparisons. When they look at mutation and evolution, they also look at rRNA, which is ribosomal RNA, and mtDNA, which is mitochondrial DNA. And rRNA, which is ribosomal RNA, will evolve slowly, but mitochondrial DNA evolves really fast. And you only inherit mitochondrial DNA from your mom, by the way, which is why you never really have a true clone ever, unless you're going to take out all the mitochondrial DNA. Our closest DNA that we have been, or scientists have been mapping DNA sequences for years, and they have found that our closest relative is a chimp, which means that when they map our DNA and they look at our DNA and they look at our DNA fingerprints, we're closest to chimps. We also have 50% of our genetics in common with yeast, which is a fungus, and 99% of our genes are homologous to mice, which means similar to mice. So if you listen to